Hey folks, welcome back to another episode of the Change Physician Podcast. This is your host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro, with my co-host, Dr. Melissa Cady, and today's guest is Dr. Brad Block. Dr. Block is an ENT in practice out on the East Coast, so we're covering the entire geographic realm of the United States today, which is quite awesome with our airwaves here. But also, and much more interestingly, he has a podcast called The Physician's Guide to Doctoring. And for this episode, we're going to talk about Brad's journey from pre-med through medical school, and then go into why he created his podcast and what his experiences has been along the way. So, Brad, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I've been looking forward to this for a while.
All right. So let's start way back at the beginning here. You know, when all of us had a reason that we went into medicine. So why did you decide to go to medical school?
It's going to be the least inspiring reason around. I couldn't think of anything else to do. It seemed like a good idea at the time. You know, I did well in school. I did well, particularly in the sciences. I struggled a lot more with anything that wasn't the sciences. So I thought, you know what? I'll go into pharmaceutical sales because they seem to make a lot of money. And then, you know, eventually so I didn't start off in pre-med. I was a science major, so I had a neuroscience major, so it was called the biological basis of behavior. You know, my intention was not to go to medical school. Nobody in my family was in medicine. It wasn't anything that, and when I made the decision to go to medicine, my parents' first response really tells you why I actually needed to start a podcast. There was, and why my intention wasn't to go into medicine. They said, you know, you're going to have to talk to people a lot, right? Because I wasn't really that, you know, I was more of a wallflower. It might be hard to tell from my pod. I'm not as enthusiastic with my introductions as you are, Kevin, but you know, I like to try to amp myself up for the podcast. So yeah, so my intention was not to go to medical school, but then what ended up happening was I studied abroad in Jerusalem, which if you haven't been to, when the pandemic is over and we're actually allowed to circumnavigate the globe, that is, you know, a unique city. There aren't that many cities in the world that there's nothing else like it, and there's nothing else like it. So I spent a semester there, and it gave me some perspective on the gravity of what gift of life we have. And given that I did well in school, I thought maybe I should do something where it's not really the bottom line that is the major incentive. Maybe doing something that serves others would be a better use of my time. And it just so happened that one of my friends that I met studying abroad was pre-med. So the two of us kind of went on this journey together.
So you mind if I ask you a little bit more about that then? Because 6 months is not a lot of time. In your 20s, I can see where that would, or late teens, I could see where that is a big chunk of time. But was there a specific event that happened while you were over there that made you kind of change this perspective of, because almost seems like you're wanting to, I'm not necessarily say give back, but there was a higher calling involved with this for you.
I think it was just a change in perspective based on being in that city. Okay. And seeing what life is like for the people that live there, and just the history. I don't know. I'm having a tough time describing what it was about the experience that said, don't be so superficial. Mm-hmm. Have a little more meaning to your life. Life is meant to be lived with purpose and meaning, not just accumulation of stuff.
Well, that's a fantastic insight to get when you're so young. And I can see that. That's one of the gifts of travel, not to kind of get off track too much, but and you go to these locations and you see the history there, and it kind of makes you think question your own mortality a little bit, why we're on this world and where we're going to next. So pretty interesting.
Exactly.
The second part, though, I have to say, is if your parents said, you know, you're going to have to talk to somebody, but you're originally thinking pharmaceutical sales, you'd have to talk to somebody doing that too.
I didn't know what I was doing. I just knew that I was good at science, so I was going to study science. And I was at Penn, I wasn't at the Wharton School, which is the business school, but you have all these like high-powered people going into business. And I thought, you know, I'll find some businessy thing to do with a science degree. That was, you know, I was in college. So I didn't know anything about anything. the thing about medicine was, and I didn't have a path, right? I didn't have a next step, but medicine gives that to you.
Mm-hmm.
Medicine gives you the next step and the next step and the next step and the next step until retirement. Like, you have a clearly defined path, and you know, what we've all, or a lot of us have experienced with the pandemic notwithstanding, you know, the path, you're always going to have a job. There's always going to be a job. Even if it means being furloughed for a bit, you know, eventually people will start coming back to the doctor, because even if you're going to be able to go someplace and find work, even if it's not in your city of choice.
Yeah. And so starting on that traditional path of, you know, this hamster wheel we've all gotten on, where you kind of have some type of structure on what comes first, getting into medical school. How old were you when you got into medical school, and where did you go?
So I took a year off. I guess that made me 22 when I started.
Mm-hmm.
My year off was, sounds a lot sexier than it was. I was either commuting from my parents' house on Long Island or sleeping on my grandmother's couch in Manhattan, but I worked as a bartender, a personal trainer, and I taught MCAT classes. So that was a fun year, but not as fun as it sounds like it would be, because it would make like a good movie or sitcom, but no great stories out of that year. And then, so I had to take the year off. So what happened was I didn't really have guidance in terms of application. I just applied where I thought I'd get in, and I thought my application was a lot stronger than it was. So I applied to all these top schools and got rejected by all of them, except waitlisted at 2, and then got into 1. So I got into 1 medical school, and then, you know, which is SUNY Buffalo. So right on the border with Canada, one of the, if not the largest unprotected border in the world, right, with those Canadians. And if you've never seen Canadian Bacon, fantastic movie. So Buffalo, which actually shares more with the Midwest culturally and accent-wise than it does the city, New York City, and the surrounding suburbs. So spent 4 years in the Great North, where we would leave the library and our eyeballs would be frozen open because it would be so cold. It was a great place to get studying done.
Yeah, way too cold for me, but I've been up there. My grandparents had lived up in that area. So speaking of medical school and your experience, what was medical school like for you? Was that what you expected, or tough, or you just kind of plowed through it?
Yeah, it's kind of like an extension of college. I only had 1 year off. It's not like I came in so much more mature and ready to do work differently. It was an extension of college. So
Yeah.
there was a lot of studying, but also a lot of hanging out.
Yeah.
I don't know how many people are going to want me to be their doctor after hearing that, but I mean, ultimately it's another 4 years of studying and,
Yeah.
you know, doing as well as you can on the tests. And that's what college is. And that's what medical school was, except now you're having to, third and fourth years are different because those are your clerkships, right? You're in front of you're in a setting, you're an apprentice at that point. That's when you start your apprenticeship. So obviously those 2 years are not like college, but the first 2 years are, and it's kind of I think a somewhat smooth transition from one to the other.
Yeah. So did you figure out pretty quickly, or were you like most of us where we weren't sure what we're going to do, and, every rotation was something new and interesting? Or when did you find out what you wanted to do after medical school as far as subspecialty or specialty?
So I bounced around a bit. I liked interventional radiology. I liked orthopedics. One of the reasons I didn't do orthopedics is I don't follow organized sports. So I would have had nothing to talk about in the operating room, and I just assumed they wouldn't like me. So because of that, so I didn't do orthopedics. Actually, my intention was to do pediatrics and do pediatric cardiology. And so I picked, because I thought I was going to do pediatrics, when I had my choice of subspecialty, it was ophthalmology, otolaryngology, anesthesia, and something else. And so I picked ophthalmology because eyeballs gross me out and eyeball injuries gross me out. So I figured I would get over it through this rotation so that if a kid came in with an eye injury, I wouldn't be grossed out, right?
Yeah.
and I didn't get my choice. I got otolaryngology as my second choice, which ended up being serendipitous. So I also did pediatric cardiology rotation, but at the time, at least, there was no transplant program. So pediatric cardiology, the rotation consisted of mostly, you have a benign murmur. This echo is normal, you have a benign murmur. This echo is normal, you have a benign. So like a lot of their day was just that. Like, you're fine, you're fine, you're fine, you're fine. Come back in a year, we'll check again just to be sure, but you're fine. Which then when I did my otolaryngology rotation and I did a good amount of peds on that, it was they were intervening, and then someone was like, they couldn't hear, they put tubes in, now they can hear. They're horrendous snorer, they can't breathe through their nose at all. Some of these kids have failure to thrive because their adenoids are so big that they can't eat. Like, try next time you're eating something, try holding your breath while you're eating. And this is how some of them move. And then you take them to the operating room, which now that I've done, I don't know, 2,000 of them, I can tell you they're pretty simple. Once you've done a couple of them, and these kids do miraculously, they do better. Suddenly they're gaining weight. Suddenly they can sleep through the night. Suddenly they're not having these apneic episodes where their parents are like freaking out because they feel like they have to reposition them every time they have an apneic episode. And then they're better. They're better. Like so those interventions where it's like low risk, low morbidity, not such a long recovery, and you turn their life around was amazing to me. And so that's, between seeing one versus the other, that's at least, and the interesting thing is that was my experience, right? Someone else in a different location or a different time of year or something different might listen to that and be like, wow, that was not my experience when I was on otolaryngology. And that was not my experience while I was on pediatric cardiology, right? Like maybe they're seeing, they're associated with a cardiothoracic surgeon, or they do a lot more interventions. So my experience, and this is, right, I'm sure you guys have the same perspective. A 1 week rotation, a 2 week rotation, a 1 month rotation for what you're going to do the rest of your life. Like you might not choose it because the people that you're rotating with are dicks, right? Sorry. Can I, is that, I figured
fine.
that was,
Okay.
that's not such a bad word, but right. You might have that experience and now you're not doing something that you really would have enjoyed. But I know personally, I don't think there's like one right magical specialty and all the rest of them are wrong. I think it's a continuum, right? Like I could have been fine being a urologist or an ophthalmologist or interventional radiologist or an anesthesiologist or, emergency medicine. Peter, I would have been probably very happy doing a lot of these things. But
Yeah.
this is how I ended up doing otolaryngology. Or at least that was my foot in the door. And then one of my best friends, who's actually practicing in the same practice from me about 10 miles away, also said, and I'm not sure where it fit in the timeline, dude, you should check out otolaryngology. They do pretty cool stuff. I'd probably verbatim. I mean, at this point, it's like 20 years ago, but yeah.
Well, there you go.
It's so funny. You're making me think about all the stuff that happened when I was in medical school. It's the same thing, right? Like the exposure that you get is it depends on who you're with, where you are, who the attendings are doing, the residents, and it has such an impact. And and to really kind of consider that at that age, at least for me, I didn't really have a good idea of how we make decisions, right? So knowing what I know now, it's like seeing all these things that influence how you choose things. It's like, holy crap, that's like the worst environment in the world to like craft a life that you're supposed to do for the next 30 years.
Yes.
But I also had a friend, I was like, oh, you should check out anesthesia. I think he was originally going to do ENT. So I must have taken him and then all of a sudden he did anesthesia. And then I told him to do this and then he did it. But it's like, it's probably not the best way to choose your future life by whatever your friends say, but it works out. It seems to work out in some way, shape, or form. So you chose to go into ENT, and was there ever a point though that you're like, maybe this didn't make sense for me, or was there any time in medicine you're like, this isn't exactly what I signed up for?
The whole time.
You've heard it here.
Yeah, in residency, I just recall like, and I came up in the 8-hour work week. You know, like I'm 41, so when I trained, we were already completely under the 8-hour work week. But you know, one of the ways they contended with that was they took a hospital that was previously in-house call, but wasn't, you know, the call wasn't that busy, and they just made it home call. So now, like, easy. You know, we still have the same number of attendings. We still have the same number of clinics to cover. We still have the same number of surgeries to cover. Like that didn't change. If anything, they hired more attendings while we were there. So the amount of work didn't change. We didn't have any advanced practice providers, physician extenders, mid-levels, whatever name, you know, physicians, assistants, and nurse practitioners. We didn't have any. It was just the residents doing all the work. So it was hard. It was a lot of work. And there were many times where me and my co-residents would look at each other and be like, are we quitting? We're going to quit? Are you ready? You're going to do it? Are we going to do it now? We were just so beaten down. We were very, you know, there were many points. Now, this is not unique to my program, right? Like, it's not like my residency experience was any different than anyone else. If not, they were also like worked more than we did, if anything, because if you look at my resume, there's a significant lack of research. So somehow, you know, people managed to go through my program and just kill it with regards to research on top of all of the work that we had. So, you know, I can bellyache all I want. There were definitely plenty of people that worked a lot harder and produced a lot more than I did, but still, it was rough. It was rough. Residency is medical school. Not that bad. Residency is really where the rubber meets the road. Yeah. And it changes you. It changes you. Like, you know, there are points in my day where I'm like, my wife is really enjoying our kids right now. And all I can think of what needs to be done next. You know, like that's how we think, because we're just trained that way. Like we triage, make a list, what needs to be done. We gotta check all this stuff. Are the teeth brushed? Are there, you know, is there milk warm? Is there pajamas laid out? Are there diapers changed? Are there like what, like, come on, let's go. We got to move. And like, she'll be sitting there reading with one of them. Like, and I need to be more like that. Obviously I need to be more mindful. But residency changes you because of that, because, you know, your time is always occupied with something.
Yeah. You know, I'd like to dig into that a little bit because I have the same struggle. What's that? I don't
know if I just stepped in something here.
No, it just, I can't really say it's everybody, but you make a really good point on this, the way that we're wired and trained. I mean, neurologically, we are wired we have so much to get done that we have almost no other choice but to think of the next thing that needs to be accomplished or checked off, and out of concern maybe for patients, and, you know, to make sure we cross all our T's, dot all our I's, and do right by the patient so no bad outcomes happen. Do you feel like do you think this is something you see in other people and yourself a lot when it kind of transfers over into your personal life, where it's a challenge to be present and not be thinking of what I need to do?
Absolutely. That's one of the main things that I'm trying to work on more in my life is being present, because it's constantly like, what do I have to check off my list? And, you know, our profession is different, at least because I do predominantly outpatient. I spend anywhere from a half to a full day in the operating room a week. But the other day, all my other time is in the office. So it's always like the patient that's in front of me, take care of them, and then the next patient. And it's always like the next patient, the next patient, the next patient, the next patient. So I don't have to struggle to be present in that setting at all, right? Because I'm able to be laser focused on the patient and their needs. But I'm also, at that point, I'm also maybe distracted by writing the note or, writing whatever orders they need or whatever it is that we need to do in order to complete their visit and take good care of them. But then when I get home, it is, this is where the wheels come off. And, I need to be more present with my wife and with my kids and with my friends. And what I've found, actually, one of the things from my podcast, and I don't even remember which episode it was, and it might not have even been my podcast. It might have been from listening to someone else's, where it's being present. It's something that I've talked about is different from listening. Like when I'm with my patients, I try to be present. And then one of the ways that you can get good at being present with your patients, rather than, when we're taught in medical school, you have to listen, make sure you're a good listener, be a good listener, make sure you listen. Like, what does that even mean? I think I understand it better when it's be present, like be focused on what they're talking about and them and their needs, and don't be distracted by anything else. One of my interviewees, one of my guests referred to that as listening with both ears. So you make sure you're listening with both ears. And one of the ways that you can get good at that is practice doing it in other parts of your life. Practice doing it with your friends. Practice doing it with your spouse. Practice doing it with your kids. But because I'm in a different setting, I'm running through that list. What needs to happen next? What needs to be done?
Yeah.
And it's hard to just, even now, I'm almost 10 years out of residency, and it's hard to get out of that mindset.
Yeah. So for residency, how long was your residency?
5 years.
5 years. And so you went into private practice, and as far as the traditional game plan that you were talking about earlier, where along this traditional path, did you decide to do something different, like a podcast? And why? So
it's that resident mindset. So what happened was I initially lived in Manhattan, but I worked on Long Island, and it was quite a commute. Not so, maybe like 45 minutes in either direction. As one of my co-residents said, the suburbs is where youth goes to die. So I was single at the time, so I had to live in the city where there are other single people. And so I spent a lot of time on the road. And so what was I going to do? I ended up discovering podcasts. Discovering maybe isn't a great word. I didn't discover them. I didn't invent them. They were there, and I listened to them. So I could use my time usefully, right? Instead of just listening to the radio and having these moments, free moments, where you can just relax. No, I can't do that. I have to use my time productively. And my wife makes fun of me because I would sometimes eat. I would sometimes go surfing after work, and then I would have a sandwich to eat on the way home. So I wouldn't have to, so I'd be able to multitask, just eat and drive. And so sometimes the sandwiches, they were frozen and they didn't defrost over time, in time. So I would, because I didn't keep them in a freezer pack. What was I think I could just, so I would be eating frozen sandwiches while I was like wet and sandy on my drive home. And she was like, I rescued you. The same woman that combed my hair because I had forgotten that this was going to be a video interview as well. Makes fun of me because she rescued me from frozen sandwiches. So that's, that's how we live our lives. Like these free moments, I have to take advantage of them and be doing something. Mm-hmm. So what would I do? I would listen to podcasts. And what I found, so there are kind of two reasons for doing the podcast. One was I listened to podcasts that tried to, this brings back what my parents said to me when I decided to go into medicine, which was, you're going to have to talk to people. So, I wasn't the best at engaging with people. I always thought I didn't want to do it. I wasn't interested in doing it, but really what it came down to was I wasn't good at it. So what did I do? I just didn't do it. So I didn't talk to, I was single. I didn't talk to anyone at bars. I would just go and hang out with my friends and not meet anyone new. And, I wasn't very good at being single. So thank God I'm married now. So, I tried to figure out how could I better interact with my patients, right? We're with them for a very short period of time. How could I make sure I'm doing everything to the best of my ability? And so I would listen to podcasts that were about they call it social engineering. And so this one that I listened to is called The Art of Charm. And the host of The Art of Charm it is about dating. But the host of The Art of Charm, the history is interesting, eventually peeled away from the company because he was outgrowing it. His podcast became about just being a better human being at everything, right? Not just, he realized that like a lot of the social dynamics that he was interviewing people about could be used in other parts of your life. So he said, well, why don't I spin it to that? And then we're just not in this niche. And they were like, you're out of here. So he ended up doing his own show. His name is Jordan Harbinger. So he was the inspiration because I was listening to him to get better at these interactions, right? And there was a lot of that out there. There were a lot of people that would talk about dating or coaching executives or lawyers on social interaction, but nobody was talking to doctors about it. And, you know, it's kind of important for us to be able to interact socially, or not socially, but professionally with our patients. Yeah. But it doesn't get talked about that much. So I thought, I'll start my own podcast. And 4 years after I had that idea, I finally executed. And here we are, and I'm a little over 2 years into it. And the other reason I did it is because when I walked into my exam room, when I was hired, I was first an associate. Now I'm a partner. I just a plug to my practice. I'm a partner at ENT and Allergy Associates, which is the largest ENT practice in the country. We're actually 5 times bigger than the second biggest practice in the country. We're all over the New York metropolitan area, like New York and New Jersey, in all the suburbs of the city, all 5 boroughs. We're a monster practice. So I looked, and I'm still with them 9 years later, and I love my practice. I think they do things so well. It's such a well-oiled machine, and it's physician run. You know, it's run by we have a board of elected partners. So, you know, we're not working for the man. We're working for ourselves. So I looked at my 2 exam rooms, and after medical school, college, medical school, residency, I now looked at these 2 exam rooms and thought, so this is where I'm going to be spending my next 40 years. Okay. Let's hang those diplomas up on the wall and see what happens now. So what the podcast does is it gives a little more depth to me. First, it helps me because I get better. It's like I get a personal coaching session every single time from someone that can help me be better at being a physician. And the episodes apply to almost every single specialty almost all the time. Like that's what I try to make it about. And it gives me something more interesting so how was your day today? You know, how was your week? You know, we tend to see the same things over and over and over, you know, and I'm not going to be talking about my patients. You can't. HIPAA violation, it's just ethically wrong. So it gives me, you know, something a little more interesting to talk about.
No, that's fantastic. And I particularly love how you notice just like, well, this is so important, but we don't get practice. So how can I go out and create something that gives me practice and actually then also gives to the listeners those same soft skills that we were not taught in medical school, which is always kind of shocking. That medicine is such a human-centric, or it should be a human-centric practice. And yet, you know, as you mentioned the Krebs cycle on your website, we learn about the Krebs cycle, but we don't learn about communication strategies, motivational interviewing, or reflective listening anywhere in that whole practice. So,
Exactly. I've never once needed to know where fumarate is in the Krebs cycle for treating any of my patients. And I see about 400 patients a month for the last 9 years, and not once has that come up. So if you're out there on a medical school curriculum or writing the questions for step 1, please think about that for a second.
Think about that. Well, and that's a good point. But what do you think? So you started this podcast, and were there any episodes, or were there any guests that you had on that really, like, you saw an epiphany or something that's like, wait a second, whoa, this makes a lot of sense, and how it's relevant to medicine, or any sort of experience like that where you're like, whoa, I didn't even expect this to come out of my podcast, but it did?
So one of the episodes was with Blake Eastman, who is a poker player, a professional poker player. And he started the first brick and mortar poker school. And but he's an expert in nonverbal communication, right? So he teaches people about tells, and he does his own studies. He's actually very academically minded, and he's done consulting work for physicians and hospital systems before, right? It's not like this was my great idea to have him on the show. He's kind of known in this space. And, I was expecting him to talk about just where you should have your hands in your lap, where you be mirroring people, and what should your facial expressions be. And he said, physicians need to exude two things: interest and authority. And I thought the way that he broke it down into those two things was so succinct, right? Like interest. Well, how do you express interest? That's your facial expressions, right? Like you furrow your brow a little bit. And one of his things was not like, I tend to use my eyebrows a lot. Now that I'm seeing myself on the screen, it explains my children, because they tend to use their eyebrows when they talk. It's better on them. But he said, like, squinting is something, if you just do this the whole time, they're going to think you're totally not listening to anything they're saying. Right. But you kind of use your lower brows, you lean in a little bit, and that's going to show, although I've been in the sun all day, so I don't think it's coming across in my image, but so that's how you express interest. And then vocal tonality is for authority. So when you're speaking to someone, you have to speak using an authority-like voice, because if you're patients aren't going to really treat that well. So you need to be interested and you need to be authoritative. And I thought that was such a succinct way to think about it. Yeah. Another one was Scott Dickers, who founded The Onion. And like some of these guests, I don't know how I got them on my show, but somehow I did. So the guy that founded The Onion, that teaches how to be funny, he actually wrote books: How to Write Funny, How to Write Funnier, and I think there was a third one, How to Write Funniest. And one thing that he said about being funny was, and he's got these different ways, these funny filters. Like if you're explaining comedy, he has it broken down into 18 different funny filters. Well, that was a reference, and that was so he has different ways to do it. But what he said was, when you're talking to patients, always comedy is for comforting the afflicted or afflicting the comfortable. So if you're going to make a joke, either be afflicting the comfortable or comforting the afflicted, but you never want to, obviously, afflict the afflicted, which is who we're seeing, right? So you have to make sure your comedy is pointed in the right direction. And then if you bomb in a joke, then you're the comfortable one. So you have to turn it around on yourself and make yourself the butt of the joke. And it's very easy to do. Just say, I'm glad I'm sticking to medicine and not having a career in comedy. Right? So it's easy to save, and it's unlikely that your patient has listened to this episode or my episode and are going to know that you stole it from him or took it from him. So feel free to use it.
They may even appreciate that, though. Oh, you're using that thing I heard on Dr. Block's podcast, Doc. That's great to hear. Even though your joke sucks, sorry, but that's awesome.
So I'm curious, did you have some hesitancy when you went to start the podcast about just putting yourself out there?
Yes and no. I mean, my company, I had to run it by them first. My practice, I had to make sure. And so they were like, yeah, send us the episodes before they go out. And after I sent in like 3 or 4 episodes, I realized they're not listening. They might have listened to the first one to make sure that I am, that I'm not doing anything that's not legit.
Yeah.
But after that, they lost interest. But no.
Good.
I should say yes, because it makes me sound pretty arrogant. That I didn't have any hesitancy about putting myself out there. I've been hesitant to put a couple things out there. Like I had an episode about Lyme disease, and I was concerned about it being identified by a certain audience, and that would then take to online reviews in order to smear me because they didn't agree with what the interviewee had to say about Lyme disease.
Sure.
There's a lot of vitriol out there. I had another one with about vaccines. It was just about, wasn't even about, are vaccines, should you be giving vaccines?
Yeah.
The assumption being we both were on the same page with that. Her episode was about how to talk to people in a constructive way about vaccines. And I think she did such a wonderful job, not being, the big takeaway from that one was, before you react, just listen to what they have to say. Listen. And then, you don't have to hit a home run every time. Just be engaged, take their perspective into consideration and listen, and then respond to their concerns. So, but I was concerned in those two instances about being identified and then, my livelihood, which this is not. My podcast is not my livelihood. In fact, it is a black hole for my finances. I'm doing nothing but pouring money into it and getting none in return. That's really the big issue with it, is that it's not even financially, but just time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like, it's time that I could be seeing more patients or spending time with my family or doing another hobby. So it does certainly, because it doesn't add anything to my life financially, it only takes it away. It's a little bit of an issue, but it's just it's a calculated decision.
Yeah. Do you think that it's kind of an extension of how I think we're naturally inclined to be learners academically, and it gives you that little outlet to keep learning, and at the same time maybe helping other people learn those things too? Do you feel like it's kind of fills that need?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for my show, I'm the avatar. I've had a couple of people on where I wasn't, that wasn't totally something that I would have thought of. Or something that I thought was relevant to my practice or my life. But the overall, that's probably like 2, maybe 3, I think, or maybe just 1. But the by and large, they're questions that I want answered. And I just assumed if I wanted them answered, then other people would want them answered as well.
Sure.
So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah. Yeah. Kevin?
I like that. I'm the avatar for this. And I was thinking about, well, and there was a couple, tons of different things that were hit on here, where Melissa, you were talking about, is there like almost an academic aspect to this? Because I kind of wonder, you leave, once you leave training and you start into practice, it is very easy to fall into the grind. Like, if you are not at an academic center, you are going to be seeing and doing the same things every day. And while you're meeting new people, it's the same thing every day. So it's in a lot of ways, it could be almost seen as an assembly line and I could see where physicians, we generally have some intellectual curiosity. Sometimes that was beaten out of us by all the learning that we did. But I'm kind of curious, have you found yourself to be more engaged now with learning after starting the podcast? Has it kind of opened up that intellectual side, or did you ever lose that intellectual side at any point in your career?
I think the lack of research in my residency is telling. But it was, it's not that I wasn't reading. Like, we're constantly studying, we're constantly trying to improve. But yeah, when you go into private practice, you're just not around it that much. You're not going to grand rounds. You're not, you're seeing the same things over and over. And so, yeah, I think, Melissa, what you were asking before, that this is, and Kevin, what you're getting to now is, this is my way of continuing to improve. Yeah. This is my way of and helping others to, listening to the podcast. And I might not even started it if I had found, a podcast like mine at the time. And now there are others out there, and I don't appreciate the competition. Thank you. But I was on another podcast, and when they put it on social media, the tagline was, "You should not start if you're a physician, you should not start a podcast," because apparently that's what I said. And I'm pretty sure it was in the context of like what I'm saying now, which is I don't need the competition. But no, it's you know, I think we get into the habit of self-improvement. We're constantly trying to get better. And what am I not doing in my practice? I'm not pushing the limits of what I can do surgically, right? I'm not doing cerebrospinal fluid leaks and skull-baked tumors and head and neck cancer resections. Like, these are some of the things, microvascular reconstructions. These are the types of things that I did in residency. But what I'm doing now, I do, you know, a lot of tubes, tonsils, adenoids, septums, sinus surgery, sleep surgery. I do some voice and swallowing disorders. You know, that's it. You know, maybe a couple of things that I can't think of offhand, like preauricular sinuses, fine. But like, I'm doing the things that I've done 1,000 times before. Mm-hmm. So, you know, and each time I do it, I think I'm getting better at it, but at the same time, I'm not exploring new devices and new techniques and new, you know, if something comes out as a new technique in the literature, I'm certainly going to try it. And I've incorporated some new devices into my practice, but, you know, I'm not doing the super complicated surgeries that we did in an academic, that were done in an academic center. I send those to the academic center because they are best done at an academic center, right? With some exceptions, I'm sure, but you know, especially being in the New York metropolitan area, right? We have a ton of academic hospitals. Like, we live in the shadow of the city, and on Long Island, there are some great hospitals. So I send to people that do that stuff all the time. So because I'm not doing that, what can I be better at? How do I continue to improve? Well, I make sure that my patients are getting the best physician in front of them, because a lot of otolaryngology is medical management. Because we spend so much time in the office, how do I get better at those interactions? So I see that as that's my continual improvement, is how do I get better at that interaction? How do I recover from a bad joke?
Yeah. So if physicians want to learn a lot of these things that, you know, you've put on your podcast, where would you direct them? We'll put it in the notes too, but if you want to give a shout on your website to find that podcast.
So just, my website is physiciansguidetodoctoring.com. It's not a blog. It is just a podcast. And so it is a jumping off point for said podcast, just so people can find it easily. There's nothing more on my website other than episodes. So Physician's Guide to Doctoring, if you look up either Bradley Block or Physician's Guide to Doctoring, it'll pop up in any of your podcast players. I'm everywhere. I think I'm everywhere. I'm on Twitter at Physician's Guide, where I basically just use it to post episodes. I do interact a little bit on Twitter, but not very much. I'm not on Instagram. I haven't figured out what I could possibly post other than episodes on Instagram. And I'm definitely not on Pinterest or TikTok or Etsy. I can't see myself being on there. Facebook, again, same thing. Sometimes I'll like repost other things. You know, I do the same thing on Twitter. I'll retweet, but that's pretty much it. Physician's Guide to Doctoring, anywhere great podcasts are sold.
Awesome. Kevin, any last questions?
No, I really enjoyed this though, and talking to you, Brad, today, and thank you so much for coming on the show. I loved your perspectives here. Interesting enough, you pulled up all these old memories that I was having about. Oh yeah, I remember that.
Were they memories or were they nightmares?
Are they really nightmares if you learn something from them?
All right, fair enough.
But no, it was great. I feel like I could talk to you for another couple hours, which is always what I love about this podcast, is that we get to interview wonderful people and interesting people. And thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Well, thank you for having Melissa and Kevin. This was a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, another entertaining and educational episode. Much more education to be found on his Physician's Guide to Doctoring website /podcast. You can find him at all the venues for the podcast. For those of you listening, this is the Change Physicians podcast. I'm Dr. Melissa Cady with my co-host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro, and our awesome guest, Dr. Brad Block. And we'll see you on the next episode.
Take care.